The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Captain Elena Martinez walked across the tarmac of the remote airbase. Her boots echoed against the concrete as she approached the row of fighter jets lined up like metal giants waiting for battle. Most pilots would have chosen the newest aircraft, the ones with the latest technology and the shiniest paint jobs. But Elena's eyes fixed on something different. At the far end of the hangar sat an old interceptor that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a combat zone. The paint was faded and chipped in places. Small dents dotted the fuselage where mechanics had hammered out damage from decades of service. This jet had flown during conflicts that most of the younger pilots only read about in history books. Some airmen joked that it was held together with spare parts and prayer. Elena ran her hand along the wing. The metal felt rough under her fingers, marked by years of wind and weather. She could see where panels had been replaced, creating a patchwork pattern across the body of the aircraft. The control panel inside still used analog gauges instead of the digital displays that newer pilots trained on. There was no fancy computer system to help with targeting or navigation. Everything would depend on her skill and instincts. The base commander had tried to talk her out of this choice 3 times already. He stood nearby now, shaking his head as he watched her inspect the old machine. The enemy they faced was flying the most advanced fighter jets ever built. These aircraft could reach incredible speeds and carried weapon systems that could lock onto targets from miles away. Intelligence reports said the enemy pilots were among the best trained in the world. Elena's squadron had lost 2 pilots in the last week alone. Both had been flying newer jets with all the modern equipment. The enemy seemed to anticipate every move, countering strategies that should have worked perfectly. Traditional tactics were failing. The advanced technology that everyone relied on wasn't enough anymore. Something had to change. She climbed into the cockpit of the old jet. The seat had been repaired so many times that the leather was a different shade in several spots. The smell of oil and old hydraulic fluid filled her nose. When she flipped the switches to start the engines, they coughed and sputtered before finally roaring to life. The whole aircraft vibrated in a way that modern jets never did. Her crew chief, a grizzled veteran named Rodriguez, appeared at the side of the cockpit. He had been working on military aircraft since before Elena was born. He knew this old jet better than anyone on the base. Rodriguez had personally rebuilt its engines twice and replaced countless parts over the years. He looked at Elena with concern in his weathered face. Rodriguez had seen too many pilots get cocky and not come back. He had attended too many memorial services. But he also saw something in Elena's eyes that reminded him of the great pilots from his early days in the service. There was determination there, but also a deep respect for what she was about to face. Rodriguez told her about the jet's quirks. The left engine ran slightly hotter than the right one. The stick pulled a bit to port during high-speed turns. The weapon system took an extra 2 seconds to lock compared to newer models. These weren't flaws to him, though. They were characteristics. Knowing them meant understanding the aircraft as a living thing rather than just a machine. Elena listened carefully to every word. She asked questions about the jet's history and its previous pilots. Some had flown this same aircraft in conflicts halfway around the world. Others had used it for training missions over friendly territory. Each pilot had left their mark somehow. She found initials carved into the edge of the instrument panel, and a small photograph tucked into a gap near the throttle controls. The briefing had been clear about what she faced. Enemy fighters would be patrolling the disputed airspace within the hour. Their mission was to intercept any hostile aircraft and protect the ground forces moving through the region below. Command expected the enemy to send their best pilots flying their fastest jets. Everyone knew this would be a severe test. Other pilots in her squadron were already in their aircraft, running pre-flight checks and reviewing their tactical plans. They were flying jets that cost millions more than the old relic Elena had chosen. Their cockpits glowed with digital displays showing everything from fuel consumption to threat warnings. Computer systems would help them track multiple targets and calculate firing solutions automatically. Elena strapped herself into the old ejection seat and secured her helmet. The radio crackled with voices as the control tower began coordinating the launch sequence. She could hear the nervousness in some of the younger pilots' voices. They were about to face an enemy that had been dominating the skies for weeks. As she taxied toward the runway, Elena felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. She had trained for years to become a fighter pilot. She had studied the tactics of legendary aviators from past wars. She understood aerodynamics and weapon systems. But all that knowledge felt different now as she sat in this old aircraft preparing to face the fastest enemy jets in existence. The tower gave her clearance for takeoff. Elena pushed the throttles forward and felt the ancient engines respond with a powerful surge. The jet accelerated down the runway, slower than the newer aircraft but building speed steadily. The nose lifted and suddenly she was airborne, climbing into the morning sky with the sun breaking over the mountains in the distance. The altitude indicator climbed steadily as Elena guided the old interceptor through layers of thin clouds. Below her, the landscape transformed into a miniature world of browns and greens. Rivers looked like silver threads winding through valleys. The other jets from her squadron had already raced ahead, their superior speed allowing them to reach the patrol zone first. Elena didn't try to keep up with them. She knew this aircraft couldn't match their velocity in a straight race. Instead, she focused on the feel of the controls and the sound of the engines. Every vibration told her something about how the jet was performing. The left engine was indeed running hotter, just as Rodriguez had warned. She made a mental note and adjusted her fuel mixture slightly. The radio chatter increased as the squadron approached the border zone. The newer jets had their radar systems active, sweeping the sky for any sign of enemy aircraft. Their computers processed hundreds of data points every second, looking for threats. Elena's radar was far simpler. It showed basic information but lacked the sophisticated tracking features of modern systems. She climbed higher, pushing the old jet toward its maximum ceiling. The air grew thinner and the temperature dropped. Frost began forming at the edges of her canopy. Most pilots stayed at medium altitudes where their jets performed best. But Elena had a different plan forming in her mind. Sometimes the oldest tactics worked precisely because everyone had forgotten about them. The first warning came from one of the forward scouts. Enemy fighters had been detected approaching fast from the east. The squadron leader ordered everyone into defensive positions. Pilots began maneuvering their jets into the formations they had practiced countless times. Computer systems linked the aircraft together, allowing them to share targeting data and coordinate their attacks. Elena stayed high and alone. The squadron leader called her position twice, asking why she wasn't joining the formation. She responded calmly that she was maintaining an overwatch position. It wasn't exactly true, but it bought her time to execute the plan that was crystallizing in her mind. Through her canopy, she could see the contrails of the approaching enemy fighters. They were moving incredibly fast, just as intelligence had predicted. These weren't ordinary pilots or standard aircraft. The enemy had invested heavily in developing jets that could outrun and outmaneuver anything they faced. Their success rate in recent engagements proved how effective they were. The enemy jets split into two groups as they approached. It was a classic pincer movement designed to catch defending aircraft in a crossfire. Elena watched as her squadron tried to counter, breaking their formation to avoid being trapped. Individual dogfights began erupting across the sky as jets twisted and turned, each pilot trying to gain advantage over their opponent. The newer jets from her squadron had better acceleration and could pull tighter turns than Elena's old aircraft. But the enemy jets were still faster and more agile. She watched as one of her squadron mates fired missiles that the enemy easily evaded with electronic countermeasures and sharp maneuvers. The technology everyone had relied on wasn't providing the expected advantage. Elena kept her old jet high above the chaos. She shut down her radar to avoid being detected. Without the radar active, enemy jets wouldn't see her as easily on their sensors. This was a technique from decades ago. Before everyone assumed radar would always be running, she relied on her eyes instead, scanning the sky and tracking the movement of the fight below. One enemy pilot was clearly more skilled than the others. His jet moved through the air like it was alive, anticipating the moves of his opponents before they made them. He had already damaged one aircraft from Elena's squadron badly enough that the pilot had to break off and head back to base. Now this enemy ace was pursuing another one of her teammates. The pursuit was leading them in Elena's direction, though neither pilot realized it yet. The enemy was so focused on his target that he wasn't checking his high position. This was the moment Elena had been waiting for. She pushed her throttles forward and angled the old jet into a steep dive. Gravity and engine power combined to accelerate the interceptor far beyond its normal maximum speed. The airframe shuddered as it exceeded its design limits. Warning lights began flashing on the instrument panel, but Elena ignored them. Rodriguez had told her this jet was stronger than the specifications suggested. Decades of repairs and modifications had actually reinforced parts of the structure. She dove like a hawk dropping on prey. The old jet screamed through the air, picking up speed with every second. The wind resistance made the controls heavy, requiring all her strength to make adjustments. Her G-suit inflated, squeezing her legs and abdomen to keep blood flowing to her brain as the forces increased. The enemy ace finally noticed her, but too late. His jet was already at maximum speed trying to catch Elena's teammate. He couldn't accelerate anymore, and his turn radius at that velocity was too wide to evade effectively. Elena's ancient targeting system struggled to lock on, the computers processing data far slower than modern equivalents. She didn't wait for a perfect lock. Experience told her where to aim. Her fingers squeezed the trigger and cannon rounds tore through the sky. The old jet carried a weapon that newer aircraft had abandoned in favor of missiles. But cannons had no electronic signature to detect and no countermeasures could stop them. The enemy jet took hits along its wing and engine section. Smoke began pouring from the damaged aircraft as the pilot fought to maintain control. He had no choice but to break off his attack and turn away, desperately trying to nurse his crippled jet back to friendly territory. Elena's squadron mate escaped, his voice coming over the radio with a mixture of shock and gratitude. He hadn't even known Elena was there until she appeared like a ghost from above. The other enemy pilots saw what happened to their ace and suddenly became more cautious. They weren't invincible after all. The damaged enemy jet limped away, trailing smoke while its wingmen provided cover. Elena pulled her aircraft out of the dive, fighting against the G-forces that threatened to make her black out. The old interceptor groaned and shook but held together. She leveled off and immediately began scanning the sky for new threats. The mood over the radio had shifted dramatically. Moments ago, her squadron had been on the defensive, struggling against an enemy that seemed unbeatable. Now there was hope in the voices she heard. Pilots began coordinating their attacks more aggressively. Seeing the enemy ace driven off had proven these opponents could be defeated. But Elena knew the fight was far from over. The enemy still had numerical superiority, and their jets remained faster than anything her squadron could field. She checked her fuel gauge and saw that the steep dive had consumed more than she expected. Every maneuver at high speed burned through fuel rapidly, and the old engines weren't efficient by modern standards. 2 enemy fighters broke away from the main engagement and began climbing toward her position. They had identified her as a threat now. She watched them approach, their sleek forms cutting through the air with intimidating speed. These pilots weren't making the same mistake their ace had made. They were coming at her with full awareness and tactical discipline. Elena turned her jet and headed toward a cloud bank to the west. The enemy pilots probably assumed she was running away, trying to hide in the clouds to avoid combat. Their jets accelerated as they gave chase, eager to eliminate the pilot who had wounded their leader. But Elena had no intention of hiding. As she entered the clouds, visibility dropped to nearly zero. Gray mist surrounded the canopy on all sides. Flying in clouds was dangerous because you couldn't see other aircraft or know what was above or below you. Modern jets had sophisticated instruments that helped pilots navigate safely through weather. Elena's old aircraft had basic instruments that required more skill to interpret. She pulled back on the stick and went into a steep climb inside the cloud. The enemy jets entered the clouds behind her, their radar systems tracking her position easily. But radar only told them where she was, not what she was doing. They expected her to keep running in a straight line, or perhaps try to turn and evade. Instead, Elena pushed the old jet into a maneuver called a Herbst maneuver, something that was extremely difficult and rarely used anymore. She cut her speed dramatically while pulling up hard, causing the aircraft to pitch nearly vertical. At the same time, she applied full rudder. The jet seemed to hang in the air for a moment before its nose came around in a tight rotation. The old airframe wasn't designed for this kind of aerobatic stress, but decades of modifications had made it stronger than the engineers who built it ever intended. The maneuver flipped her around so she was now facing back the way she had come, with far less altitude than before. She dropped out of the bottom of the cloud, just as the 2 enemy fighters were still climbing through it, searching for her. They flew right past her position, their superior speed now working against them. By the time they realized what had happened, Elena was behind them and already lining up her shot. The trailing enemy pilot saw her first and called a warning to his wingman. Both jets immediately broke in opposite directions, a trained response to avoid being targeted. But the old interceptor, while slower in straight flight could turn surprisingly tight at lower speeds. Elena stayed with the closer target, matching his turn. Her cannon rounds reached out again, walking across the sky toward the enemy jet. The pilot was skilled and kept varying his altitude and direction, making it nearly impossible to predict where he would be from one second to the next. But Elena had flown combat missions for years. She understood the rhythm of a dogfight. She fired in short bursts rather than holding down the trigger. Each burst was aimed not at where the enemy jet was, but where it would be. On her fourth burst, rounds connected with the enemy aircraft's tail section. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough. The pilot felt his controls become sluggish and decided to disengage rather than risk being shot down. The second enemy pilot came around hard, determined to avenge his wingman. His jet's missiles locked onto Elena's aircraft and warning tones filled her cockpit. She had only seconds before he would fire. Modern jets would have released countermeasures automatically, confusing the incoming missiles with flares and electronic signals. Elena's old aircraft had countermeasures, but they were limited and had to be deployed manually. She released a pattern of flares while simultaneously diving toward the ground. The enemy pilot fired 2 missiles that streaked through the air with incredible speed. The first missile was fooled by the flares and detonated harmlessly. The second missile stayed locked on target. She dove steeper, pushing the old jet toward the mountainous terrain below. The missile followed, its seeker head tracking the heat from her engines. Warning lights blazed across her instrument panel as the aircraft exceeded multiple safety limits. She could see the rocky peaks rushing up to meet her. At the last possible moment, Elena pulled up hard and skimmed along a ridgeline. Rocks and trees flashed past her canopy so close she felt she could reach out and touch them. The missile, traveling much faster, couldn't adjust its trajectory quickly enough. It slammed into the mountainside behind her and exploded in a ball of orange flame. The enemy pilot who had fired the missile was now in a difficult position. He had used his altitude to chase Elena down, and now he was too low and too fast near dangerous terrain. He had to pull up and gain altitude again, which meant breaking off his attack. Elena used those precious seconds to turn and climb back toward safer airspace. Her fuel warning light came on. The constant maneuvering and high-speed flying had drained her tanks faster than normal operations would have. She had maybe 15 minutes of flying time left before she would be forced to land wherever she could. The nearest friendly airfield was 20 minutes away at her current speed. The squadron leader called over the radio asking for status reports from all pilots. 3 aircraft had taken damage and were returning to base. 2 more were low on fuel and breaking off from combat. The enemy had lost 1 jet confirmed destroyed, 2 damaged and retreating, and their ace was out of action. It wasn't a decisive victory, but it was better than any engagement the squadron had fought in weeks. Elena looked at her fuel gauge again and made a quick calculation in her head. She could try to make it back to the main base, but she would probably run out of fuel before reaching the runway. The alternative was to land at a small forward airstrip that was closer, but had minimal facilities and a shorter runway. With the old jet systems, landing on a short runway would be challenging. Before she could make her decision, the radio crackled with an urgent message. Ground forces in a valley below were under heavy attack and requesting immediate air support. Enemy ground units had them pinned down, and without help, the entire unit would be overrun within the hour. The squadron leader asked if anyone had weapons remaining and enough fuel to provide cover. Most of the squadron was already heading back to base, either damaged or low on fuel. The few jets still in the area were engaged with remaining enemy fighters. Elena checked her weapons status. She had used most of her cannon ammunition, but she still had 2 unguided rockets left. They were old weapons, the kind that required a pilot, to aim the entire aircraft at the target rather than relying on computer-guided systems. She radioed that she could provide support for 10 minutes before her fuel situation became critical. The ground commander gave her coordinates and described the tactical situation. Enemy armored vehicles were advancing up a narrow mountain pass toward friendly positions. The terrain made it difficult for ground forces to stop them, but it also meant the enemy vehicles were channeled into a predictable route. Elena turned the old interceptor toward the valley. As she descended, she could see smoke rising from multiple points on the ground. Flashes of weapons fire dotted the landscape like angry fireflies. The narrow pass was exactly where the ground commander had said it would be. With enemy vehicles moving in a column through the rocky terrain, flying low for a ground attack mission was dangerous in any aircraft, but especially in an old jet without modern targeting systems or armor protection. Anti-aircraft guns could track her approach and fill the air with deadly fire. One good hit could bring her down, but the soldiers on the ground were depending on her, and she had committed to helping them. She lined up her approach, coming in from the west with the sun behind her. This would make it harder for enemy gunners to spot her until she was already on top of them. The old jet roared down the valley at low altitude, her airspeed building as she descended. The enemy vehicles grew larger in her windscreen. She could see soldiers scrambling as they realized an aircraft was attacking. Tracer rounds began arcing up toward her, red lines of light reaching through the air. Elena ignored them and focused on her target. The lead armored vehicle in the column was the key. If she could disable or destroy it, the entire column would be blocked in the narrow pass. She fired her first rocket when she was close enough to see the details on the vehicle below. The rocket left a trail of smoke as it streaked toward the ground. Without computer guidance, the rocket flew a ballistic path based entirely on where she had aimed the aircraft. Her timing and angle had to be perfect. The rocket hit the ground just ahead of the lead vehicle and exploded with tremendous force. The vehicle swerved to avoid the crater and crashed into the rocky wall of the pass. Its engine caught fire, and thick black smoke poured from the damaged armor. The vehicles behind it immediately stopped, unable to pass the burning wreckage. Anti-aircraft fire intensified as every enemy gun turned toward Elena's jet. The air around her seemed to fill with deadly metal. She pulled up hard and banked away, feeling impacts along the bottom of her aircraft. Warning lights indicated damage to non-critical systems, but the engines were still running strong. She came around for another pass, approaching from a different angle to avoid giving the gunners an easy targeting solution. The enemy soldiers had dismounted from their vehicles and were setting up more anti-aircraft weapons. They knew she had one rocket left, and they were determined to shoot her down before she could use it. Elena dropped even lower this time, flying barely 20 feet above the ground. At this altitude, the mountainous terrain flashed past on both sides in a blur. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and she would fly straight into a rock face. But flying this low also made it harder for anti-aircraft guns to track her because she disappeared. Behind terrain features, before gunners could get a clear shot, she popped up over a ridgeline directly above the stalled enemy column. Surprised gunners tried to swing their weapons around, but she was already on top of them. She fired her last rocket at the cluster of vehicles in the middle of the column. The explosion ripped through two vehicles and sent debris flying in all directions. But the enemy wasn't finished. A shoulder-fired missile launched from somewhere below and came racing toward her jet. The Seeker had locked onto her engines immediately. Elena released her last few flares and pushed the throttles to maximum, trying to outrun the weapon while also gaining altitude to give herself options. The missile ignored the flares. It was a newer model, with better Seeker technology that could distinguish between the heat signature of flares and the sustained heat of jet engines. Helena watched it approach in her mirrors, knowing that if it hit, she would probably not survive. The ejection seat in this old aircraft was functional, but decades old. There was no guarantee it would work properly. She waited until the missile was almost upon her, then cut her engines completely and popped the speed brakes. The sudden deceleration was violent, throwing her forward against the straps that held her in the seat. The missile, programmed to hit the hot engines, shot past her aircraft and exploded several hundred feet ahead. Elena immediately restarted the engines and pulled up hard to avoid the explosion's shockwave. The old jet shuddered but responded to her commands. She climbed away from the valley, her mission complete. Behind her, the ground commander was radioing thanks. The blocked enemy column had been stopped, giving friendly forces time to regroup and establish better defensive positions. But Elena's problems were far from over. The fuel gauge showed almost nothing left. She had maybe 5 minutes of flying time remaining. The nearest airstrip was still too far away. She would have to find somewhere to land immediately, or prepare to eject and lose the aircraft. The weeks following that mission brought significant changes to how the squadron operated. The base commander ordered a complete review of their tactical doctrine. He brought in veterans who had flown during earlier conflicts, asking them to share knowledge that had been forgotten as technology advanced. Training programs began incorporating maneuvers and strategies that hadn't been taught in years. Elena found herself teaching classes to other pilots. She demonstrated the techniques she had used, explaining not just the mechanics but the thinking behind them. Some pilots struggled with the older methods. They had become dependent on computer systems and found it difficult to fly purely on instinct and experience. But others took to it naturally, discovering abilities they didn't know they had. The old jet became something of a legend on the base. Rodriguez and his crew maintained it carefully, making repairs and improvements based on what they had learned from the combat mission. Other maintenance crews began looking at their older aircraft differently, realizing that age didn't necessarily mean obsolete. Some systems that had been considered outdated actually had advantages in certain situations. Intelligence reports indicated that the enemy was confused by the changing tactics. Their pilots had been trained to fight against predictable strategies and modern aircraft. They had developed counters for every system and procedure their opponents used. But when Elena and other pilots began employing unexpected techniques, the enemy's advantages decreased significantly. The enemy ace that Elena had damaged in their first encounter survived and eventually returned to flying. Intelligence later learned that he had requested all available information about the pilot who had defeated him. He became obsessed with understanding how an inferior aircraft had gotten the better of him. This obsession made him cautious in subsequent engagements, reducing his effectiveness. More missions followed over the next month. Elena continued flying the old jet, now formally assigned to her by the squadron commander. Each mission added to the aircraft's history and to Elena's reputation. She became known for finding creative solutions to tactical problems. Other pilots started asking her advice before missions, wanting her perspective on how to approach difficult situations. Not every mission was successful. They still lost pilots to the enemy's skilled aviators and superior aircraft. The war wasn't won by one person or one aircraft, but the squadron's overall performance improved dramatically. They were no longer simply trying to survive encounters with the enemy. They were winning engagements and completing objectives. The media eventually learned about Elena's missions and the old jet she flew. Reporters wanted to write stories about the underdog pilot in the ancient aircraft taking on the enemy's best. The base commander carefully controlled what information was released, not wanting to compromise operational security. But some stories did get published, and they had an unexpected effect on morale throughout the military. Soldiers serving in other areas heard about a pilot who refused to accept that newer always meant better, who studied history to find solutions to modern problems, and who proved that determination and skill could overcome technological disadvantages. It became a symbol of the broader war effort, a reminder that they were not helpless against a better-equipped enemy. Elena never sought the attention or acclaim. She was uncomfortable with being treated as a hero. In her mind, she had simply approached a problem differently than others had. She had trusted in her training and in the capabilities of an aircraft that others had dismissed. The fact that it worked didn't make her special. It just meant that sometimes old wisdom was still valid. Rodriguez felt vindicated by everything that happened. He had spent his entire career maintaining aircraft that others considered obsolete. He had argued for years that older systems had value if properly maintained and intelligently used. Now his beliefs had been proven correct in the most dramatic way possible. He continued working on the old jet with pride, knowing that his skills as a mechanic had contributed to its success. The enemy eventually adapted to the changing tactics. Their pilots began studying historical combat techniques themselves. They modified their training programs and adjusted their strategies. The advantage that Elena had created by doing the unexpected gradually diminished as the enemy learned to expect it. But by that time, the tactical situation had shifted in other ways. Peace negotiations eventually began, though the fighting continued even as diplomats talked. Elena flew combat missions right up until the ceasefire was declared. Her last mission in the old jet was a simple patrol that encountered no enemy aircraft. She landed that final time with mixed emotions. Relief that the fighting was over, but also a strange sadness at closing this chapter of her life. After the war, Elena was promoted and transferred to a training command position. She spent years teaching new pilots, always emphasizing the importance of understanding the fundamentals of flying and fighting. She taught them to respect history and learn from it, rather than assuming that new was always better. Many of her students went on to distinguished careers, crediting her influence. The old jet was eventually retired from active service and placed in a museum. Rodriguez personally oversaw the process of preparing it for display. He made sure every scratch and dent that told the story of combat was preserved. A plaque described the aircraft's history and the missions it had flown. School children visiting the museum would press their faces against the glass, imagining what it must have been like to fly such a machine into battle. Elena visited the museum occasionally over the years. She would stand quietly looking at the jet, remembering the missions and the people she had served with. Some had not survived the war. Others had moved on to different careers and different lives. But they had all been part of something important. A moment when determination and creativity had proven that the fight was never truly over, until you decided to stop fighting. The lessons from that period influenced military thinking for years afterward. Training programs incorporated historical tactics alongside modern techniques. Equipment decisions considered not just raw capability, but how systems could be used creatively. The assumption that technological superiority guaranteed victory was questioned and examined more carefully. Elena eventually retired from active duty with full honors. She wrote a book about her experiences, focusing not on glorifying combat but on sharing the tactical and strategic lessons she had learned. The book became required reading at several military academies. Young officers studied her missions as examples of adaptive thinking and unconventional problem-solving. In her retirement, Elena sometimes spoke at military conferences and schools. She always emphasized the same themes. Study history because the past holds lessons for the present. Don't dismiss old methods just because they're old. Technology is a tool, not a solution by itself. Victory comes from how you think about problems, not just what equipment you have available. The old jet remained in the museum, a permanent reminder of a moment when someone had taken what everyone else considered obsolete and proven them wrong. Children grew up hearing the story, learning that limitations could be overcome with creativity and determination. The jet that had been too old, too slow, and too outdated had become a symbol of something much larger than itself. Elena scanned the terrain below, looking for any flat area long enough to land the jet. Mountain peaks surrounded her on all sides, offering no good options. A road ran through one valley, but it was too narrow and curved too much. She spotted what looked like a dried lake bed in the distance, but her fuel situation meant she might not reach it. The engines began sputtering as the fuel pumps struggled to draw from nearly empty tanks. She had to make a decision immediately. Elena spotted an old abandoned airstrip that intelligence had mentioned in briefings. It had been built decades ago during a previous conflict, and then left to decay when the fighting moved elsewhere. The runway was cracked and overgrown with weeds in places. It was shorter than ideal and had no support facilities. But it was her only realistic option. She radioed her position and intentions to base, then committed to the approach. There would be no second chance. She had fuel for one landing attempt and nothing more. The old jet responded sluggishly as she descended toward the abandoned strip. Damage from the anti-aircraft fire had affected some of her control surfaces. The aircraft wanted to roll left, and she had to hold constant pressure on the stick to keep the wings level. Her airspeed was lower than normal because she didn't have fuel to waste on go-arounds. She cleared a line of trees at the end of the runway with barely 10 feet to spare. The wheels touched down hard on the broken concrete. Elena immediately applied the brakes, feeling them grab unevenly on the damaged surface. The jet bounced once, twice before settling onto the runway and decelerating. Chunks of concrete kicked up behind the aircraft as the tires fought for traction. Elena deployed the drag chute, a backup system that newer jets didn't even carry anymore. The chute blossomed behind her and added its resistance to the brakes. The far end of the runway was approaching fast, with a line of old hangars marking where the usable surface ended. She pumped the brakes to avoid locking the wheels completely, a technique from the era when this jet was built. Modern anti-lock systems would have done this automatically, but she had to do it manually. The jet shuddered and shook but continued to slow down. With 50 feet of runway remaining, the aircraft came to a complete stop. Elena sat in the cockpit for a long moment, her hands still gripping the controls. Her heart was pounding and sweat soaked her flight suit. The engines finally sputtered their last and went silent as the fuel tanks ran completely dry. She had landed with literally nothing left. After shutting down all systems, Elena climbed out of the cockpit and dropped to the ground. Her legs felt weak after the stress and G-forces of the combat mission. She walked around the aircraft, inspecting the damage. Holes from anti-aircraft fire dotted the underside of the fuselage. A few panels were loose where shrapnel had torn through, but overall, the old jet had held together remarkably well. Within an hour, A helicopter arrived from the main base carrying Rodriguez and a small maintenance crew. The crew chief jumped out before the helicopter fully landed and ran toward the jet. He circled it twice, examining every inch of damage, making notes on a pad he carried. Rodriguez looked at Elena with an expression that mixed concern and respect. He had seen the combat reports coming in throughout the mission. He knew she had engaged the enemy's best pilots and won. He knew she had supported the ground forces when no one else could. And he knew she had brought his aircraft back alive when most people would have written it off. The maintenance crew began working immediately to make the jet flyable enough to return to base. They patched holes, replaced damaged components, and refueled the tanks from barrels they had brought on the helicopter. Rodriguez supervised every repair personally, ensuring nothing was overlooked. While they worked, the squadron leader arrived on another helicopter with the base commander. They wanted to debrief Elena while the details were still fresh in her mind. She described every engagement, every decision, and every maneuver. The commander listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about specific tactical choices. When she finished, the commander was quiet for a long moment. He had been skeptical when Elena chose the old jet. He had thought it was a poor decision based on sentiment rather than tactical reality. He had expected her to struggle against the enemy's superior aircraft. Instead, she had proven that skill and strategy could overcome technological advantages. The commander asked Elena to explain her thinking. Why had she chosen an aircraft that was slower and less capable than what the enemy flew? Her answer was simple but profound. Everyone had been trying to beat the enemy at their own game, using technology to counter technology and speed to match speed. But the enemy had better technology and more speed. Elena had decided to fight differently. She used tactics that the enemy wouldn't expect, because they came from an earlier era of air combat. She used the limitations of her aircraft as advantages, accepting that she couldn't win a straight race but finding ways to turn fights into situations where speed wasn't everything. She had studied historical battles and learned from pilots who had won against superior opponents. The squadron leader asked about the specific maneuvers she had used, particularly the vertical reversal in the clouds. That maneuver was considered too risky for modern combat, because the new jets weren't designed for it and pilots weren't trained in it anymore. Elena explained that she had practiced historical maneuvers on her own time, believing they might be useful someday. News of the engagement spread quickly through the base. Other pilots wanted to hear first-hand accounts. Some were skeptical, thinking Elena had just gotten lucky. Others saw the potential of her approach and wanted to learn more. The younger pilots especially were fascinated by the idea that old tactics might work against new threats. Rodriguez finished the repairs as the sun began setting. He pronounced the jet airworthy for the flight back to base, though he wanted to do more extensive work once they returned. Elena climbed back into the cockpit, feeling the familiar seat and controls. Despite everything the aircraft had been through, it felt solid and reliable. The flight back to base was uneventful. Elena kept the old jet at moderate speeds and altitudes, not wanting to stress the repaired systems. As she approached the base, she could see people gathered near the runway. Word had spread about what had happened, and pilots and ground crews had come out to watch her land. She touched down smoothly and taxied to the hangar. As she shut down the engines, applause erupted from the watching crowd. It felt strange to receive such attention. She had simply done her job the way she thought it should be done. But she understood what the applause really meant. It was hope. Hope that they could win against an enemy that had seemed invincible.